We've discussed the nature of truth and found that it is best described as correspondence with the world. A proposition is true when it corresponds to the way the world is. We also discussed the definition of knowledge and discovered it is, some objections aside, justified true belief. But the question still remains, is knowledge really possible? We discussed ways of gaining evidence and justifying belief, but is it really possible for a belief to be justified enough to count as knowledge? In fact, we might wonder how it is possible to come to know something if it is not already known. I mean, we can always learn something we don't know from someone else through testimony, and the reliability of testimony is something that we will talk about in a later lecture. But suppose that you don't know something, and you don't know anyone else who knows it, and you don't have any way of contacting someone who does. Suppose you can't even do a web search for it. In fact, suppose you're in a situation where you don't know something and no one else does either. How could you come to learn the truth? How could you gain knowledge in that situation? The ancient philosophers Socrates and Plato actually thought they were in this situation regarding a great many things. Plato and Socrates both lived in Athens around the same time. Socrates taught in the Agora, and Plato was one of his students. Interestingly, however, it is mostly through Plato that we know about Socrates and his teachings. See, Socrates never wrote anything down. To preserve his philosophy, Plato started writing down conversations that Socrates had. Now, of course, it's not like Plato had a dictation machine or perfect memory, so we shouldn't consider his dialogues recorded history. Plato was just giving us the gist of what was said. Indeed, Plato sometimes recounted conversations that never even happened, like when he has Socrates talk to the pre-Socratic philosopher Parmenides. Plato was just imagining what a conversation between them would have sounded like given their philosophical views. Later, Plato even moved to using his dialogues to capture his own philosophy, even though he still used Socrates as his main character. Interestingly, the only conversation Plato recounted that we're pretty confident he was present for was Socrates' defense of himself in front of the court in Athens. The dialogue that recounts it, the Apology, mentions specifically that Plato was there. Now, there is debate about why charges were brought against Socrates, but in his defense against them, Socrates actually says something relevant regarding the possibility of knowledge. He tells the story of how the oracle at Delphi said that no one was wiser than him, no one was wiser than Socrates. Socrates found this puzzling, given that he actively professed to know nothing, at least not anything worth knowing, like the nature of piety or justice or virtue. So he set out to prove the oracle wrong by finding someone who did know the nature of such things. After all, there were plenty of people who said they did, but after such questioning, such persons, he discovered, they only thought they knew. In reality, they didn't know at all. And this, it turns out, is why Socrates is the wisest. He is the only person who owns up to his ignorance. Knowledge may really be impossible, so no one really knows anything, but Socrates is the wisest because he is the only one to admit it. But Socrates actually tackles the possibility of knowledge head-on in a dialogue called the Meno. In it, a man named Meno and Socrates, or Plato's version of Socrates, are trying to discover the nature of virtue. Meno offers up a few ideas, but all of them fall short. He can give examples of virtuous behavior, but not a definition. Virtue can't simply be to desire to do good, because everyone desires to do that, but not everyone is virtuous. Virtue can't simply be the power to attain the good, because one can do so unvirtuously, perhaps by lying about something to protect the innocent. And you can't say that being virtuous is attaining the good virtuously. That's circular. Eventually, Socrates and Meno settle on a kind of vague answer, that virtue is a certain kind of knowledge. But they are still unclear exactly what knowledge virtue requires. And since they don't know, and they don't know anyone who does know, they become genuinely concerned as to whether they ever will know. To this effect, Meno presents what is now known as Meno's paradox, a paradox that seemed to suggest that gaining knowledge is impossible. So, suppose you don't know what something is. It seems impossible to start your search for knowledge for that thing, since you wouldn't know where to start. And you certainly can't end your search, since you don't know what it is. You wouldn't know you had found it even if you did. And if you can neither start nor finish your search for knowledge of something, your search can never be successful. So if you don't already know what something is, you never will. In other words, it seems that gaining knowledge is impossible. As an example, suppose I ask you to find a stimmy. Now, obviously you have no idea what a stimmy is, and you don't know anyone who knows. And if I know, I'm not telling you. So, how would you go about finding one? How would you go about figuring out what a stimmy is so that you could acquire one? You could walk around picking things up and examining them to see if they're a stimmy, but you wouldn't know what a stimmy is, so you would have no idea whether or not any particular thing was a stimmy. You could walk right out of the room with a stimmy on your head and you wouldn't even know it. Now, Plato suggests an interesting solution to this paradox through the mouth of Socrates, the theory of recollection. According to the ancient philosophers, to seek knowledge of something like virtue is to seek knowledge of what an abstract object is like, what they called a form. But what exactly is a form? Well, think about the Pythagorean theorem, discovered by the philosopher Pythagoras. A squared plus b squared equals c squared. Pythagoras proved that when a stands for the length of one side and b for the other, and c for the hypotenuse, this ratio holds for all right triangles. But now how could that be? How can one single thing be true for all right triangles? Pythagoras thought it was because all right triangles resemble the perfect right triangle, the form or idea of a right triangle, a kind of non-physical abstract object that is the perfect example of a right triangle. And because the square of the length of the hypotenuse of the form of a right triangle equaled the sum of the square of the other two sides, Pythagoras thought this was true of all right triangles. And philosophers like Plato suggest that this is true for just about everything. Well, actually, not just about everything, everything. According to Plato, everything is what it is because it resembles some form. What does it mean to resemble a form? Well, think about all the different kinds of chairs that exist in the world. Office chairs and chairs in the classroom and recliners and those weird chairs that make you sit on your knees. You might say that they all are chairs because they resemble, they participate, or they reflect the form of chair, the abstract ideal of chair. Likewise, when something is virtuous, it is virtuous because it reflects or resembles the abstract ideal of virtue. So, Socrates suggests, we could learn what virtue is, even if we and no one else knows what it is, by recalling the nature of the form of virtue itself. And we can do that, he says, because our soul was once acquainted with the form of virtue. According to Socrates, there is a realm in which all these forms exist, and our soul existed in that realm before we were born. Upon being born, our soul forgot much of what it once knew, but we can remind ourselves of that knowledge with a simple process of questions and answers. To prove this point in the Meno, Socrates calls over one of Meno's slave boys. He draws a square in the dirt, and for the purposes of our discussion, let's say that it's 2 feet by 2 feet. He says he wants to know how to draw a square that would have twice the area of his square. The area of the original square is 4, so we're looking for a square that has an area of 8. Double the area. That's easy, says the slave boy. Just double the length of each side. Well, how long would that make each side? Well, 4 feet. So what's its area? Well, 4 by 4 is 16, so 16. Oh wait, says the slave boy. That's 4 times the area of the original square, not twice. Well, let's see. If we started with 2 and 4 is too much, well, then maybe it's 3. Was that right? Socrates asks. Well, 3 times 3 is 9, so no, we need a square with an area of 8. So I guess I don't know the answer. I think you do, says Socrates, and I can reveal that you know the answer by simply asking you questions you already know the answer to. So tell me, how could you turn the square into 2 triangles? Well, that's easy. You just draw a diagonal line from corner to corner. Does that divide the square into equal or unequal parts? Well, it divides it into equal parts. So what's the area of each triangle? Well, the original area of the square was 4, so the area of each of those triangles would be 2. Now, what if I were to draw another square on top of this one that divided it the other way? Would those triangles have the same area? Well, of course they would. Then their combined area would be 4, right? Well, their combined area would be 4, of course. Well, what if we were to do this again on the right with 2 more squares? What would be the combined area of these 4 triangles? 8. Oh, that's how you double the area. You need a side as long as the diagonal of the original square. See, Socrates says, I told you that you knew. Your soul just had to recall what it once knew. Now, how well this argument works is debatable. I tend to think that Socrates is just asking some leading questions. After all, the problem is supposed to be, how could we gain knowledge of something if we don't already know the answer? Yet the slave boy does know someone with the answer, Socrates. And Socrates is asking the questions. Plato scholar R.E. Allen would disagree, saying that the real point is that the slave boy's mind could be led to the answer, which would not be possible unless he already knew the answer. Regardless, the entire thing is predicated on an absurdity. Most philosophers today agree that there isn't really a realm of forms for our soul to hang out with before we're born. Indeed, as we will see later, even the idea that humans have souls is on pretty thin ice. Furthermore, as a threat to the possibility of any knowledge at all, the paradox falls short. It's concerned with how we can learn the definition of a word or the nature of a concept, but of course there are other kinds of knowledge. I could discover the boiling point of water through experiment. I can learn what something tastes like by tasting it. This isn't, of course, the kind of knowledge that Plato was too concerned about, but it is knowledge nonetheless. Lastly, we might find a way to gain the knowledge that Plato was looking for in the later works of Ludwig Wittgenstein. He suggested that, as children, we learn the meanings of words by learning how they are used in our community. We try to use them and adjust how we do so by how others react to our usage. Like, a child might learn what congratulations means through some disapproving hushes after he uses it at a funeral. Perhaps we can learn the meaning and nature of something like virtue in a similar way. Then again, Plato might wonder whether the community's use of the word actually matches up to the true nature of the form. But the possibility of knowledge faces a much more severe threat at the hands of another philosopher, the 17th century Frenchman René Descartes. In his famous Meditations, Descartes declared that he wanted knowledge, certain, unshakable knowledge. Descartes had the foundational view of knowledge we talked about last lecture. Our common beliefs are based on other beliefs, which are based on others, a process that eventually bottoms out in foundational beliefs, beliefs that aren't based on any other beliefs. So, since the certainty of your knowledge would be only as certain as the foundation of your belief system, Descartes wanted to discover certain, unshakable, indubitable beliefs. His primary concern was to ground scientific inquiry, which was at its infancy in the time. But if he could discover such beliefs, he could actually build his entire belief system upon them and know that it was rock solid. So, trying to found unshakable foundational beliefs, he starts going through his beliefs, trying to find one that it's not possible to doubt in any way. And as he goes through, he finds that most of them are pretty easy to doubt. Then, he found one that most would consider so obviously true that it could not be doubted. the belief that the world around us exists. For Descartes, at the time, it was the belief that he was sitting in front of his fire in his chair. This seemed indubitable to him. But as Descartes realized, even this is doubtable. After all, he could be dreaming. We've all had that vivid dream we thought for sure was real. If you're like me, you've even considered the possibility that you were dreaming, but concluded that you weren't. While dreaming, I've literally had the thought, if I know anything at all, I know that what I'm experiencing is real. Of course, it turns out I'm dreaming. But Descartes took it even further, saying, it's possible that all that exists is me and an evil demon, a demon set on fooling me into thinking that the world exists when it doesn't, by, say, placing ideas in my mind and perceptions of a world that doesn't really exist. So Descartes suggests, I can't be absolutely certain that the world I'm experiencing right now actually exists. I might be being fooled into thinking so by a dream or a demon, and there's no way to know that I'm not. This is called the skeptical problem. And to be absolutely clear, Descartes and those who raise it are not suggesting that we or they actually are in a vivid dream. What they're suggesting is this: the fact that you cannot prove that you're not dreaming eliminates your ability to know that you're not dreaming. Thus, you can't know the world you are experiencing is real. Indeed, even if you are currently in the middle of a vivid dream, you couldn't know that either, because you couldn't prove that you weren't actually awake. Perhaps I can put the problem in more familiar terms. Recall that when we talked about abduction, we talked about testability and fruitfulness. One of the first steps when comparing hypotheses is to make predictions based on those hypotheses and see which hypothesis gets the prediction right. If hypothesis A predicts outcome P when doing experiment Z, and hypothesis B predicts outcome Q when doing experiment Z, well, then you do experiment Z to see which outcome occurs. P would suggest A, and Q would suggest B. But suppose hypothesis A and B both make the same prediction. They both predicted the same outcome when doing experiment Z. Then doing the experiment couldn't tell you which hypothesis is correct. Or suppose that hypothesis A and B always make the same prediction in all circumstances. For any given experiment you could do, they would predict the same result. Then there would seem to be no way to prove which hypothesis is right. Well, this seems to be the situation we're in when it comes to comparing the I'm awake hypothesis to the I'm in a vivid dream hypothesis. If you were awake, what would you be experiencing right now? You'd be hearing my voice, feeling whatever you're sitting or standing on, and feeling certain that you're awake, everything that you're experiencing right now. But that's also what you would experience if you were vividly dreaming right now, right down to the feeling certain that you were awake. That's one of the things that makes vivid dreams vivid. They come with an experience of certainty. But if you can't know whether you're dreaming right now or whether the world you're experiencing is real, then what could you know? Initially, it seems nothing is more certain than this. But if not even that counts as knowledge, it seems nothing does. Of course, you might pinch yourself to see if you're dreaming, but of course, you could still dream the experience of pinching yourself and not waking up. Any test that you did to try to expose the fact that you were dreaming, you could fail by simply dreaming that you passed that test. And even if you do wake up, you still don't know you're awake because you could just have awoken into another dream. Like in the Christopher Nolan film Inception, where Dom Cobb uses layered dreaming to fool people into thinking they have woken up, when in reality, they are still asleep. Indeed, as one of the most important arguments in all of philosophy, the skeptical problem has inspired many great science fiction movies. Perhaps the most notable is the movie The Matrix, where the protagonist Neo discovers that the world we live in is all a dream. Well, actually, he realizes it's not a dream, it's a computer simulation, but it's basically the same problem. In the movie, we learn we're all hooked into a computer that causes our brains to produce sensations identical to those we would have if we were actually experiencing the real world. See, we actually experience what we experience as a result of electrical signals being sent to different parts of our brain. Our eyes, after interacting with light, send signals to our visual cortex, which ultimately produces our visual sensations. Well, if a computer programmer simply knew the right kind of signals to send, he could send them down your optic nerve and make you see whatever he wanted you to see. And he could do the same with all of your senses, making you experience whatever he wanted, whatever world he wanted you to experience. And this isn't even something you could wake up from. The programmer could perpetually keep you in that state. Now, how can you know this isn't actually the case, that you are not in the matrix right now? Can you prove you're not? Everything you're experiencing right now is consistent with the hypothesis that you are in the matrix, including, by the way, the certainty that you feel right now that you're not in the matrix. Indeed, since the certainty you feel is a result of your brain activity, the computers could even make you feel that certainty to assuage any doubt that you have. Just send the right signal to your brain. It could even make you think it's silly to consider the possibility that you're in the matrix to make sure that you never catch on. This is a troubling problem indeed. Now, in an attempt to solve the skeptical problem, Descartes kept trying to find something that was indubitable. And what he eventually thought he found was his own existence. His argument went something like this: try as he might, the evil demon could never succeed in making me believe I exist when I don't. For to be fooled at all by the demon, I must exist. Even if I'm dreaming, I must exist to be doing the dreaming. In fact, the very act of doubting that I exist is inconsistent with the hypothesis that I don't exist, because I cannot doubt unless I exist. Thus, it is impossible to doubt the notion of my own existence. In the mere act of doubting, I prove that it's true. As Descartes said, quote, I must finally conclude that this proposition, I am, I exist, is necessarily true whenever it is put forward by me or conceived in my mind, end quote. In fact, it is from Descartes that we get the famous Latin phrase, cogito ergo sum, or as you probably know it, I think, therefore I am. Now, that exact phrase doesn't appear in the Meditations, but the basic notion is there. By the mere act of thinking, I prove that I am thinking. And I can't be thinking unless I exist. So the fact that I'm thinking proves that I exist. I think, therefore I am. In this way, Descartes thought he had found the unshakable foundation of his belief system, his own thinking and his existence. We'll discuss later why Descartes may have been wrong even about this. Indeed, we'll actually consider arguments that suggest that persons don't exist at all. I know that may sound strange, but you'll be surprised to see how convincing such arguments can be. But even if we grant Descartes these bits of knowledge, it's not clear that he can use them as a foundation for his belief system, to justify his confidence in scientific inquiry and his knowledge of the world. And this is because of how he goes about trying to build up from those bits of knowledge. His argument goes something like this. So, I know that I exist, and with that comes knowledge of my thoughts or ideas in my mind. I may not know if my experiences are accurate, but I do know that I'm having them. I know the content of my own mind. But I know that content includes the concept or idea of God, a perfect being. I also know that something less perfect cannot create something more perfect. So I could not have created this idea of God that I have in my mind. In fact, the only thing perfect enough to create this idea would be God himself. Thus, Descartes says, I can know that God exists. And if God exists, seeing that he is perfect and that deception is an imperfection, God would not deceive me into believing the world is real when it is not. Nor would he allow me to be deceived into believing the world was real when it was not. Therefore, the world is real, and my experiences of it are reliable. Now, Descartes' argument is actually flawed in many ways. He says he knows that something less perfect can't create something more perfect. But how exactly does he know that? He says that it's a clear and distinct idea, but it's far from clear or distinct. Furthermore, it's quite obviously the case that God's existence is not the only explanation for the fact that Descartes has an idea of God in his mind. First of all, if the world is real, we could construct such an idea by looking at things in the world. We could get the idea of a being by looking at other beings in the world, and get an idea of improvement by looking at better and better things in the world, and from these we could simply conceive of a being that can't be improved. What's more, Descartes' idea of a perfect being is not more perfect than him. Descartes has confused the object of the idea with the idea itself. The idea of a perfect being is not a perfect being. A perfect being would be more perfect than Descartes, but an idea of a perfect being is pretty unremarkable. It's just something that exists in your mind. A perfect being is able to do anything, but the idea of a perfect being can't do squat. It just sits in your mind presenting itself to you. It's not really all powerful or all knowing. It's an idea of something that is, but the idea itself is not. Even if Descartes was only dreaming, it would be quite easy for him to generate such an idea in his mind. So, it seems that we may be stuck with Descartes' problem, or at least we can't know anything beyond the unremarkable fact of our own existence. We can't even know that anyone else exists. All I can know is that I exist, and all you can know is that you exist. But I think we actually can solve Descartes' problem, or at least show that knowledge is possible. The mistake that Descartes seems to make is that he's equating knowledge with certainty. Descartes wants an unshakable foundation for his knowledge so that the set of beliefs he derives from that foundation can be indubitable. That's a fine goal to have, and it may be a goal that's impossible to reach. But that's not what the goal we're concerned with. Notice the title of this lecture is not, "Is certainty possible?" but "Is knowledge possible?" And knowledge does not require certainty. Recall that our definition of knowledge is justified true belief. And I can be justified in believing something is true without being certain that it is true. For example, if something is beyond a reasonable doubt, then I'm justified in believing that it's true. If something is the best explanation for some phenomenon, then it is beyond a reasonable doubt. We talked about the process of finding the best explanation in an earlier lecture. Remember our invisible light bulb gremlins? And indeed, we can likely use this process to get out of Descartes' skeptical problem. Recall that the "I'm being fooled" hypothesis and the "I am awake" hypothesis both make the same prediction. They predict that the same thing regarding what we would be observing right now, and thus they are both equally testable and fruitful. But those are only two of the criteria of adequacy. We should also consider whether one of the hypotheses has wider scope, is simpler, and is more conservative. And when we consider the "I'm awake" hypothesis, it seems it is better and it fits the bill. It certainly is more conservative. It aligns more directly with things I think that I know, like the world is real. It also is more explanatory. It explains the experiences I'm having without raising a bunch of unanswered questions. Unlike the "I'm being fooled" hypothesis, which raises all kinds of questions about who's fooling me and the methods they're using to fool me and why they're fooling me, etc. The waking hypothesis explains my experiences quite nicely. The waking hypothesis also seems to be simpler in that it hypothesizes fewer entities. At the very least, it doesn't require a fooler like the fooling hypothesis does. So, although we can't be certain, it seems reasonable to conclude that our experiences actually are of an existing world. And so we can use them to gain knowledge of the world. so knowledge really is possible. But some questions remain. How accurate are these experiences? Do they really tell us what the world is like? So, even if the world does exist, how accurate is our knowledge of it? And ultimately, what is the most accurate way to gain knowledge of the world? It is to that last question that we shall turn in the next lecture.